Welcome, everyone, to our deep dive into the world of Meister Eckhart.
Oh boy.
This medieval theologian and mystic,
Sick?
you've provided us with quite the stack of readings this time.
White a stat.
Excerpts from Meister Eckhart by Frank Tobin,
Okay.
Meister Eckhart by Kurt Flash,
All right.
Meister Eckhart, From Whom God Hid Nothing,
Interesting.
Meister Eckhart's Book of Darkness and Light, and Meister Eckhart's Book of Secrets.
Wow. That's impressive. It really shows how much there is to explore in his work.
Yeah, and that's what's so intimidating for me. Where do we even begin with Eckhart? His ideas are so unconventional, even radical for his time. I mean, just the way he approaches scripture, for example.
Yeah.
It's not just reading the Bible for its literal meaning.
No, you're right. It's not like your typical Sunday school lesson.
Yeah.
He's going deeper than that. Eckhart's really diving into the text like a tapestry weaver, looking for hidden patterns and blending verses from different parts of the Bible.
So it's more about uncovering spiritual truths than just understanding the historical events.
Exactly. He's looking for the deeper meaning. Like when he interprets the opening of the Gospel of John, in the beginning was the Word,
Right.
he's not just talking about the creation of the world, he's pointing to the primacy of the Word, knowledge understanding as the foundation of reality,
Okay.
even for God.
So instead of thinking of God as this all-powerful being who created the universe,
Yeah,
Eckhart's saying God is more like ultimate consciousness or something.
you're getting close. Eckhart actually goes even further than that. He argues that God isn't just being among many, but the source of all being. Instead of being esse, he uses the term intellect, or understanding intelligere in Latin.
Hold on. So for Eckhart, God is less about existing in a particular form and more about being this pure, uncreated intelligence that everything flows from.
Precisely. And he backs this up with other passages from John. He points to John 1.3, all things were made through him, to argue that creation came about through this divine understanding. It's like God, the ultimate mind, is thinking the universe into being.
I think I'm starting to get it. But if God is this ultimate understanding, where does that leave us humans? I mean, we have understanding too.
That is where Eckhart introduces this really intriguing concept, the Funkeln, the little spark of the soul.
So there's a piece of God in each of us.
Not a literal piece, no more like a reflection. Imagine the sun shining on a lake, creating countless tiny reflections on the surface.
Okay.
Each reflection is an image of the sun sharing in its light, but it's not the sun itself.
So the Funkeln is like our own little reflection of God's understanding.
Yes, exactly. It's the part of us that's uncreated, eternal, and capable of knowing in a way that mirrors God's knowing. Eckhart even uses this idea to explain how we're created in the image of God.
Right.
Not our physical form, but this shared capacity for understanding.
That makes a lot more sense than thinking about it literally. But even this reflection idea seems pretty radical for his time. I mean, isn't he suggesting that we are all kind of mini-gods?
That's a common misunderstanding of Eckhart. He's very clear that while the Funkeln represents sameness with God and knowing, it doesn't mean our individual souls are God. We are still distinct creations.
Okay, that's helpful. But this spark idea makes me think about another Eckhart theme I keep seeing. The birth of God in the soul.
Oh yeah,
What exactly does that mean?
that's when things get really interesting, really mystical. Eckhart's talking about a state of union between the soul and God, so profound that it's as if God is born anew within us. He even says the just man in justice itself is unbegotten justice itself.
Wait, so you're saying we can actually experience God being born inside of us? How is that even possible?
That is the million-dollar question. It takes us to the heart of Eckhart's mystical teachings. We'll get to that, but first we need to understand what he means by justice itself.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Let's
Okay.
unpack that. Okay, so you were about to explain what Eckhart meant by justice itself.
Right. Well, for Eckhart, justice itself is, it's more than just fairness or following the law. It's about recognizing the inherent goodness and worth of all beings, including ourselves, because they all participate in the divine.
So when he says the just man in justice itself is unbegotten justice itself, he's not talking about someone who just follows the rules.
No, not at all.
He's describing a person who's so deeply connected to the divine that they embody that inherent goodness, that justice itself.
Exactly. It's like they become justice, not just acting justly, but being justice. And this idea, union, is essential to understanding the birth of God within.
But how do we even begin to achieve this kind of union? I mean, it sounds incredibly difficult, almost impossible.
Yeah, Eckhart doesn't sugarcoat it. He really emphasizes the importance of detachment, letting go of everything that separates us from God. He talks about breaking through the barriers of our ego, our attachments to worldly things, even our own desires.
So it's not just about being a good person or following religious rituals, it's about this deep inner transformation.
Yes, it's about stripping away everything that's not essential, not truly us, until we're left with that pure spark of the Funkeln. That's when we can truly experience the birth of God within.
But wouldn't that kind of detachment lead to emptiness? Like if we let go of everything, wouldn't there be nothing left?
That's a common misunderstanding. Eckhart's not saying we should become emotionless robots or withdraw from the world. He's talking about detaching from our egotistical attachments, our need to control, our fear of loss, our obsession with material possessions. It's these attachments that create a false sense of self and block us from experiencing true union with God.
So it's more about inner freedom than physical renunciation. Like I can
Okay.
still enjoy a beautiful sunset or a delicious meal without it becoming an unhealthy attachment.
Precisely, Eckhart uses the term poverty of spirit to describe this state of detachment. It's about emptying ourselves of all the things that clutter our minds and hearts, creating space for God to enter. And this brings us to another key concept, grace.
Okay, so what did Eckhart mean by grace? Isn't that just God's favor or forgiveness?
It's more than that. For Eckhart, grace isn't just about being forgiven for our sins. It's about being raised from nothingness to the fullness of being, which is God.
Wait, so you're saying grace isn't something God bestows upon us? It's more like an inherent quality of God that we can tap into.
You're getting it. Eckhart's view of grace is deeply connected to his idea of God as intellect or understanding. Remember how we talked about everything flowing from God? Well, for Eckhart, grace is one of those things. It's always present, always available, like a river of divine love flowing through creation.
Okay, so if grace is always there, why don't we all experience this birth of God within? What's the catch?
The catch is our own ego, our attachments, all the things that block us from accessing this river of grace. Eckhart believed that through detachment, through breaking through our limitations, we become more receptive to this divine flow.
So grace isn't something we earn, it's something we become open to.
Exactly. And that brings us back to the birth of God within. It's not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of aligning ourselves with this flow of grace, allowing it to transform us from the inside out.
It's like we're constantly being reborn into this deeper understanding of ourselves and our connections to the divine.
Yes, beautifully put. But Eckhart doesn't stop there. He takes this idea of union with God even further and introduces the concept of grunt.
Okay, I've heard that word pop up a few times in these texts. What exactly is grunt?
It's a tricky word to translate, often rendered as ground or ground of being. Imagine a deep well within you, a place of pure potentiality, where the separation between you and the divine dissolves. That's grunt. It's not something you achieve, but something you discover by letting go.
So it's like a deeper level of the Vunkelin, like the Vunkelin is the spark and grunt is the fire it ignites.
That's a great way to visualize it. Grunt is this dynamic primordial ground where God and the soul become one. Eckhart even uses the image of a river flowing back into the ocean, losing its individual form but becoming part of something much vaster.
Okay, so grunt is this ultimate state of union with God, a return to the source. But how do we even begin to access this? Is it just about more detachment?
Detachment is definitely key, but Eckhart emphasizes that we can't reach grunt through our own efforts alone. It's a process of surrender, of allowing God to work within us. And for Eckhart, the key to this surrender is Christ.
Ah, so Christ finally enters the picture. I was wondering when we'd get to him. What role does Christ play in all of this?
For Eckhart, Christ is the ultimate example of someone who fully realized their union with God, who lived from the ground of grunt. He calls Christ the door to this realization, the one who opens the way for us to experience this union ourselves.
So it's not just about imitating Christ's actions, but about somehow participating in his being.
Yes, Eckhart believed that through Christ, human nature was transformed, becoming the very image of God. By connecting with Christ, by allowing his spirit to work within us, we can tap into this transformed nature, this grunt that unites us with the divine.
This is also mind-blowing, but I have to admit it's also a bit overwhelming. Eckhart's ideas are so complex, so nuanced. How am I supposed to make sense of all of this, let alone apply it to my own life?
That's a great question, and it's one that Eckhart himself grappled with. He knew that these ideas weren't just for theologians or monks living in monasteries. He wanted people to experience the transformative power of his teachings in their everyday lives.
So how did he suggest we bridge that gap between the theoretical and the practical? How can we take these lofty ideas about God the soul and grunt and make them relevant to our daily lives?
That's where Eckhart's emphasis on living in the present moment comes in. He believed that God is a God of the present. meaning that the divine is not some distant abstract concept, but something we can experience right here, right now.
So it's less about intellectualizing these concepts and more about experiencing them directly.
Yeah.
But how do we do that?
Well, Eckhart talks about finding God always and in all ways, at all times, in all places, in any company, and in all ways.
Wow, that's a tall order. But I can see how shifting our focus to the present moment could be a powerful way to connect with the divine. It's like instead of searching for God out there, we're learning to recognize God's presence within and all around us.
Exactly. And this idea of presence is closely tied to Eckhart's reinterpretation of the story of Mary and Martha. Remember in the Bible, Mary is praised for sitting at Jesus' feet and listening to his teachings, while Martha is criticized for being distracted by household chores.
Yeah, that story always kind of bothered me. I mean, someone has to get things done right. It always seemed like the Bible was saying that contemplation was superior to action.
Eckhart turns that interpretation on its head. He argues that true spirituality isn't about choosing one over the other. It's about finding God in action. He even says, "What I call Mary is a well-practiced body that obeys a wise soul."
So it's not about escaping the world to meditate in a cave. It's about bringing that contemplative awareness into every aspect of our lives, whether we're doing the dishes, having a conversation, or going for a walk.
Precisely. It's about integrating our spiritual understanding with our actions in the world, allowing that interconnection to guide our every thought, word, and deed.
That makes so much more sense. It's like spirituality isn't something separate from our daily lives. It's woven into the fabric of our existence. But this brings me back to the idea of detachment.
Yeah.
If we're supposed to be detached from everything, how can we still function in the world? How can we have relationships, pursue our goals, or even just enjoy life?
That's a common concern, and it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with egotistical attachments. It's not about withdrawing from the world or becoming passive. It's about letting go of the need to control the fear of loss, the clinging to outcomes.
So it's more about finding a sense of inner freedom, a detachment from our ego's desires that allows us to engage with the world without being consumed by it.
Exactly. Eckhart's concept of poverty of spirit is about cultivating that inner freedom, that emptiness that makes space for God to work through us.
It's like the less we cling to our own ego, the more space we create for the divine to flow through us.
Beautifully put. And this leads to one of Eckhart's most radical and challenging ideas, the idea of living without a why. He talks about letting go of our desire for rewards, even spiritual rewards, and simply acting out of pure love for God.
Wow, that's a tall order. But I can see how it would be incredibly liberating. If we're not constantly seeking something from God, we can experience a deeper level of connection and love.
Precisely. It's about letting go of our self-centered desires and aligning ourselves with God's will, even if we don't fully understand it.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about detachment, living without a why, and integrating spirituality with action. What else can we learn from Eckhart about living a more mystical life, a life rooted in grunts? It seems like so much of what we've talked about is focused on our own transformation, this inward journey toward union with God. But I'm curious, how does Eckhart connect that personal experience to our actions in the world? It seems like it'd be easy to get so caught up in this inner exploration that we forget our responsibilities to others and the world around us.
You're right to point that out. Eckhart wouldn't disagree with you at all. In fact, he was deeply concerned with how our spiritual understanding should show up in our daily lives. Remember the Vunkelin, that spark of the divine within each of us? Well, Eckhart actually sees the entire universe as this vast, interconnected web. God's at the center, and every being, every creature is radiating outward from that source.
So we're all connected not just to God, but to each other through this spark.
Exactly. And that interconnectedness means we have a huge responsibility.
Wow.
Our actions, even our thoughts, they all have a ripple effect throughout this cosmic web. What we do to ourselves, we do to others, and what we do to others, we do to God.
That's a pretty powerful thought, realizing that we're not just isolated individuals, but part of something so much bigger than ourselves.
It really makes you think twice about how you treat others and even how you treat the planet.
Yeah, for sure.
Eckhart was ahead of his time in that way, seeing that ecological dimension to spirituality. He saw nature as a reflection of the divine and believed that caring for creation was part of loving God.
So it's not just about our own personal salvation. It's about bringing that spiritual awareness into everything we do, everything we touch.
Exactly. Eckhart's mysticism isn't about running away from the world. It's about transforming the world, bringing that light of grunt into every corner of our lives. And this leads to one of the most paradoxical parts of his teaching, the idea that we have to lose ourselves to truly find ourselves.
Okay, now you've lost me. How can we lose ourselves and find ourselves at the same time?
It does sound like a contradiction, but it goes back to detachment. Remember, Eckhart believed that our ego, our sense of separation from God and from everyone else, it's actually a false self. It's just something we've constructed that blocks us from experiencing our true nature.
So it's not about literally losing our identity, but
Mm.
about letting go of that limited, ego-driven sense of self.
Precisely. Imagine a sculptor working on a block of marble. They chip away at all the extra stone to reveal the beauty hidden inside. That's what Eckhart means by losing ourselves. Shedding those layers of ego, the attachments that cloud our perception and keep us from seeing our true essence.
Like letting go of the shell to reveal the pearl inside.
Yeah.
But doesn't that mean losing our individuality, our personality?
Not at all. Eckhart actually believed that by letting go of that false self, we become more fully ourselves. We connect with that grunt, where our individuality merges with the divine. We become something more expansive, more compassionate, more loving than we could have ever imagined.
So it's less about erasing who we are and more about reaching our full potential as human beings, as expressions of the divine.
You put it perfectly. And this process of losing ourselves to find ourselves, it's not a one-time thing, it's a lifelong practice.
Yeah.
Eckhart actually talks about the need to die to ourselves daily, to keep letting go of those ego attachments, to surrender to that flow of grace that's always there.
Like a spiritual muscle, we need to exercise constantly reminding ourselves to loosen the ego's hold and surrender to something bigger.
Exactly. And it can be hard sometimes, needing constant vigilance and a willingness to face our own limits, but the rewards are immense.
Because it frees us from that tyranny of the ego, that need for validation, the fear of failure and loss that keeps us trapped in bad patterns.
Precisely. It lets us live more fully in the present moment, to embrace life with more joy and gratitude, knowing that we're not alone, that we're part of this vast web of being, and ultimately held and loved by that divine ground of grunt.
Well, this has been an amazing journey. We've covered so much of Eckhart's thought, from how he read scripture to his radical views on God and the soul, his ideas on detachment, grace, and the birth of God within. We even touched on his masterful use of language and his vision of an interconnected cosmos. It feels like we just scratched the surface, but even these glimpses have been so enriching.
Eckhart's writing is like that, a bottomless well. Each time you go back to his work, you discover new meanings, new depths.
Always inviting us to keep digging deeper, keep questioning, keep seeking, and keep surrendering to that mystery at the heart of it all.
That's what's so great about Eckhart. He doesn't give us simple answers, but he points us toward truth, a truth we can only experience, not just grasp with our minds.
It's been a real privilege to explore these ideas with you. Thanks for joining me for this deep dive.
The pleasure was mine.
And to everyone listening, we'd love to hear what you think. What resonated with you the most? What questions do you still have? Share your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, keep diving deep into the mysteries of life. And who knows, maybe you'll even experience a little birth of God within yourself along the way.